we did our presentation on 1998, and yeah, first slide.
Okay. Some statistics of 1998, the yearly inflation rate was 1.5%. The average cost of a new house was $129,000. For context, that's the price of a lot of just like relatively fancy cars. The average income per year was $38,100. The average monthly rent was $619. A gallon of gas cost $1.15. Now it can cost $5. The average cost of a new car was $17,000, and a dozen eggs cost 88 cents. Now they can cost $5 for a second they did.
And then our first event of the year, Maple Street was established. So that's a pretty big one. Okay. And then we had the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal. It went public. It was a scandal involving the president and an intern at the White House at the time. The affair began in 1995 and it lasted 18 months. And yeah, Clinton was fined $90,000 for the scandal. And then Mark McGuire, he played in the MLB for 16 seasons, played for 2 teams, Oakland and St. Louis. And he broke the MLB home run record for one season with 70. And it was during the steroids era in the MLB, and he actually admitted to taking steroids in 2010. And
On June 7th, 1998, James Byrd Jr. was murdered. It was a racial hate crime. 3 white men tied his ankles to the back of a pickup truck and dragged him for several miles along a windy road in the middle of Jasper, Texas. In the morning, they found his head and pieces of his body all along the road. It's been faded to memory. It was supposed to be like a huge national event, and it was supposed to change the U.S. And it just faded to memory. It's not in the town history books. It's not in the town museum. They're just trying to forget about it. The white members of the town, a lot of them have taken on a victim mindset about how because they live in Jasper, they're targeted and things like that. And it's still very much an issue. George Floyd was murdered on May 25th, 2020, and that also has started to get faded too, overlooked, not really talked about as much. And then Pokhran 2 was also called Operation Shakti. It was conducted at the Indian Army Pokhran test range by India. It was a series of nuclear bomb tests that solidified India as a nuclear power. There had been previous nuclear tests that had been successful in 1974, but they relied on external resources provided by the U.S. And once the U.S. placed sanctions on those, so India could not access them, they started over to create nuclear bombs from all resources they can find in India. After Pokhran 2 was successful, the U.S. placed economic sanctions on India around the same time. On May 28th to 30th, Pakistan also became a nuclear power, which heightened tensions in the Kashmir conflict, and the U.S. placed economic sanctions on them as well. And yeah, so did Japan. And then the U.S. embassies was bombed almost simultaneous explosions blew up the U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. 224 people died in the blast and 4,500 were wounded. The attacks were directly linked to Al-Qaeda, which was the same group involved in 9/11. Looking back, it can be identified as one of the lead-up bombings, as well as the 1999 U.S. Cole bombing, which was when a smaller ship rammed into the side of the USS Cole and ended up bombing it from the inside. Over 20 people were charged in the embassy bombings and 7 are serving life sentences.
So on February 26, 1993, it was the World Trade Center bombing. September 11, 2001, also known as 9/11, is when Al Qaeda, which is the same terrorist group as other bombing, flew two planes into both of the Twin Towers, and it was a hate crime. And it was like, still is probably the biggest terrorist attack to date in the U.S., and it really shook a lot of Americans' lives.
And then USA versus Microsoft. This was when the U.S. Department of Justice and 20 other states filed complaints against Microsoft because they violated many parts of the Sherman Act, and this actually made the company break up into two entities. And this is and February 18th, 1998, there was the Anthrax scare. This was when two white separatists were taken into custody after being accused of plotting biological warfare on New York subway systems. They dropped the title, they were going to drop little bombs of bacteria that would spread through the subways and just get everyone sick, and it was going to be a really big thing. And then this is the invention of the iPhone, which was also called the iPhone 2G or the iPhone 1. And 1.4 million iPhones were bought in 2007 alone. And yeah, that was known to date as the biggest year for Apple, making, well, percentage wise, not by revenue, but they were a very popular company back then, making 3.5 billion that year alone.
On August 4th, 1998, two Stanford students founded Google, which was the first easy-to-use internet search engine available to the public. It changed how the internet was used and required a new type of literacy, mass literacy, and this also enabled misinformation to spread very easily. It changed the World Wide Web. 70% of searches today are made through Google. And it also created a new industry, Apple, which would then go on to create the iPhone. Google connects businesses and people across the world, and now the internet allows us to have live news and international communication, social media, texting. We use it in school. It's part of our everyday lives. And then on February 14th, 2005, YouTube was founded, which was one of the first big social media companies. The ISS was launched on November 20th, 1998. The US and Russia control modules were launched and then merged a month later while in orbit. In mid-2000, a Russian habitat and control center were added, which was also assembled in orbit. And then on November 2nd, 2000, the first crew was sent to the ISS, and it has been occupied since. And then various other additions have been made, like laboratories and research centers. It was a collaboration mainly of Russia and the US, but also the European Space Agency and Japan and other countries as well. SpaceX has sent two crews of people to the ISS, and SpaceX is a private company that's growing exponentially and sending groups of civilians to space for money. Then the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster was on its 28th mission. It was a 16-day-long research period in space that was very successful, and then it disintegrated on reentry between Texas and Louisiana and killed all 7 members on it and destroyed the aircraft. A piece of foam which had been repeatedly a problem, had fallen off the external tank and hit the wing, and that caused the entire spacecraft to disintegrate, and that foam had been falling every single mission, but it had been easy to repair, so the managers had ignored the technicians' concerns. And then this was also the case with the Challenger, like there's issues such as that have been problems with NASA's culture for years, and the Challenger was just not quite assembled right, and it was January 28th, months after it launched, and that sent shockwaves through the US as well.
So on April 10th, 1998, the Good Friday Peace Agreement was signed, and this is between the two different sides of Ireland, so Northern Ireland and Ireland, and it ended the 30-year-long nationalist conflict that they were having. It also developed Ireland's current government, and the way that they held the vote was by civilians and whether they thought that the government should be allowed to sign it. And then on April 20th, 1999, Columbine shooting. This occurred at Columbine High School in Littletown, Colorado. And two students, Eric Harris and Dylan Gold, were the people that shot up the school. And the bombs that they placed didn't go off, and they entered the school and just shot everywhere.
Our themes were violence in the age of terrorism, which encompassed many of them, like the World Trade Center bombings, US Embassy bombings, 9/11, Columbine, the murder of James Byrd. Also technological innovation and communication, foreign affairs, scandal, and racism. 1998 also marked a lot of important anniversaries. It was the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s death, the 30th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, and the 50th anniversary of the Harry Truman Executive Order.